Ben Mercer, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for talking to me today. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Good. So I just finished your book, Fringes, and we're going to talk about it. But before we do, I guess the first question I want to ask you is, what's the experience of being like a former professional athlete? Like you were a professional athlete, right? Is that how you would describe your job?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, I was full time. That was my job. Yeah.
Do you keep up with it now? Do you stay fit? Do you still play rugby? Do you follow the sport of rugby? How's your body doing?
Yeah. Well, one of the nice things about not playing anymore is I'm no longer in kind of sort of pain to varying degrees. I do still play a little bit of touch rugby. So that's, for people that don't know, obviously rugby without the tackling and all the contact. So it's a much kind of quicker, faster paced game, a lot of running. I've lost a few kilos since I stopped playing. So like 7 kilos lighter than when I was playing, which is quite a lot. Yeah, and I keep up with the sport, but being a bit older, most of my friends have kind of stopped playing as well. You stop recognizing so many names, so sometimes you feel very old when you see things like the England squad, where you'd know every single player, and now you sort of don't know quite a few of them, and you think, oh, like I've never heard of him, but clearly he's brilliant. So I'm probably losing touch there a little bit. I watch a lot less than I used to, but I do still keep up with it. Yeah.
Do you miss being a professional athlete?
I don't particularly. I miss the kind of, I think a lot of people miss the sort of with the boys aspect, going in, particularly in France, where you sort of say hi to everyone immediately, first thing in the morning, high fives all round, running round. It's easy to remember the good bits though, where you're running around in the sunshine as opposed to sort of the driving rain. But I think it's that kind of camaraderie that is quite a common thing that everyone misses. But there's a lot of things about it I'm happy to leave behind, like 12-hour bus trips, and yeah, like I said, the sort of physical pain and
yeah, we'll get into all that. We'll get into all that. Yeah. But I guess, like, how about the competitive aspect or the game time? Do you miss like the lights and the fans?
Well, I had a funny career. I wasn't like a top level professional. So although we did play in front of the odd big crowd, sometimes there was no one there. And it was fun, and particularly when you play one of the better teams, that's a fun buzz and you do feel that sense of occasion. But by the end, you've played so many games that quite a lot of them felt quite rote, and you stop feeling quite so excited to play. And yeah, so I'd say, yeah, you probably do miss that little sense of occasion, but it was kind of happening less and less for me personally. So it's not something, it wasn't like a giant come down for me, I suppose.
I hear you. Yeah. So I wrestled in high school and in college. And I've done some coaching of high school wrestling, and it's something I miss deeply. Like an analogy of like, it's like a feeling which I feel like I'll never get back. You know what I'm saying? That thrill. But that's obviously that's very different from playing when it's your job.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I think I suppose those games, like sometimes you do get that sort of sense of drama and that physical test, where you're really pushing yourself. It's obviously hard in the rest of your life. You kind of don't have those external stresses that push you on to those sorts of levels of performance or just effort, I suppose. But yeah, I think you're always aware that you'd have to kind of leave it behind in the end. And
right.
Like I say, there was no giant, I wasn't sort of habituated to 80,000 people cheering at me, which I think would probably be a buzz that would be difficult to leave behind,
There's a crying baby in the background. Do you hear it?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Hold on a second. I'm back from that interruption. Do you feel like you've taken sort of certain skill set, like a certain lessons with you, or certain mental toughness, and does that translate into other aspects of your day-to-day life now?
Yeah, I do think a little bit. I think some of the habits in terms of staying fit and things like that, I don't think I'll ever leave those behind. I think if I spend a day without doing some sort of exercise, like I can skip a day, that's fine. But if I didn't do any exercise for a week, I'd start feeling terrible. And I think those are really valuable kind of habits, to have that kind of discipline and rigor to keep yourself in some decent physical condition, like particularly the way like the world's gone, and being kind of fit and healthy is actually just a great safeguard against getting unwell, and I'm really kind of grateful to those habits. And I think some of the things, like I do a little bit of work with other athletes who are sort of transitioning into work. And one of the things is you don't quite appreciate how well developed some of those sort of mental toughness things are. So, I did a talk with somebody and they said, "Oh, you're quite resilient." And I thought, "Oh, I've never really considered myself as particularly resilient, but maybe I am, And I think some of those things are sort of skills that athletes are unaware that they have. I do think one of the great things, particularly about France, was kind of developing those people skills, like those teamwork skills, and being able to find common ground with people who, you've got nothing in common with, maybe apart from the fact that you work together, you play the same sport. And I think sport's great for that kind of common interest, but to then develop a kind of more of a relationship, I think those people skills and leadership skills can be really valuable. So yeah, I'd say those things have kind of carried on, I suppose.
Last question before we get into the book. Do you take cold showers?
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
I take cold showers also. How great are cold showers?
Yeah, I've been into them for a little while. Like I get up in the morning and knock out a few press ups, get in the shower, and turn it cold at the end. And I actually don't really like getting out of the shower without turning it cold now. Which is... How
about ice baths? You ever do ice baths?
Yeah, like not very often now. We used to do them a fair bit for recovery, but there's where I'm from, near Bath in the UK. There's a group of guys who go down to the river and go in the river when it's cold. So I go and join in with them when I can, or me and my other mates go down and jump in the river or jump in the sea when we're near the coast. And that stuff, I'm really into it. Yeah, I like that little kind of challenge.
So the audience now is going to be thinking like probably you and me are totally crazy for doing this. Do you want to make like one quick little pitch, like why it's worth getting acclimated to the cold?
Yeah, it's that little, I think it's hormesis, isn't it, where your body kind of has to regulate itself, and it's just giving yourself that little stress straight away in the morning. But what it really is it gives you a little win. You get a little win and you haven't even gone downstairs and made your coffee yet. So it just gives your day that early win. And it means that when I get out, I feel like a lot more alert. I feel kind of ready to go. I feel really good about myself. And you get that kind of physical buzz as well, where the blood kind of comes back to your skin, I suppose, after you kind of cool down, everything goes internal. And then as it sort of comes back out to your extremities, you get that little physical buzz as well. So it's just a really good feeling. Kick your day off with it. Yeah,
and you can work your way up, because it was very hard for me in the beginning. Like when I started, it was hard, but you acclimate, your body learns to do it, and it's anyway. Yeah, so like you said, it's a great feeling. Okay, amazing. So you wrote a book, Fringes. It's a special thing to write a book. It's not an easy thing to do. How do you feel about the reception? It's been some time, right, since you published? Been more than a year. Was 2 years almost, something like that?
Yeah, I published the ebook. That was at the end of 2019. So there's probably December. I can't remember the exact date, but the end of 2019. So it has been a little while. Yeah.
How do you feel about the reception the book's been getting?
I mean, it was much better than I wasn't expecting anything. For me, like you say, writing a book was a really hard thing. And it was something that I always, thought I'd like to do when I was growing up. My two things were sport and reading books. And I always thought, I'd love to do that one day, but I never made any kind of move in that direction, I suppose. And so just finishing it felt like a big deal to me. And it was the whole thing was partly a sort of learning experience as well, just how to actually do a project like that. It took a couple of months to get any buzz, I suppose. I gave it away for free, the digital copy, for the first weekend, just to get some downloads. And it probably sold a couple of 100 copies, 300 copies a month for the first 3 months. And I just needed those reviews on Amazon. And then there was a real tipping point. Once I got to about 25 kind of positive reviews, then I don't know what happened, but it started sort of churning over. People started discovering it, and then it really took off after that. And it was just an amazing feeling, see it top of the rugby chart. When I opened up, I was trying to find the link to send to a journalist actually, and it just said #1 in rugby. I just thought, oh wow, I hadn't expected it at all. I wasn't ready for it. It was actually quite emotional. Yeah, I can imagine. So everyone listening should buy the book. I'll tell you why I love the book so much. Okay, there's certain books that you read and they're very honest, and there's certain books that you read
that they change your perspective, because you realize that like everyone else has actually been lying. You realize like when you get a certain level of honesty, you realize like, oh my God, like how come no one's been honest before? And it's an incredible thing. So I feel like your book does that, and it deals with some very dark, kind of themes. You sort of expose the fact that there's like a dark side to professional sports, and specifically to professional rugby. There's all sorts of wild episodes. There's all sorts of like crazy violence. There's like copious amounts of like alcoholism. I don't know, alcoholism is maybe too strong a word, but alcohol consumption and the effects of that on the team. And you're very open on a personal level. You express things like self-doubt. You describe certain episodes and say that was probably a mistake on my part, things like that. And it's just like a very truthful, honest kind of book, and I feel like that's so rare.
Yeah, I felt, because I was telling the kind of story, and I was sort of dealing with things like the end of something I dedicated my life to from when I was a teenager, really. But I wanted to be honest about what it's like. I felt that honesty could be my point of difference with a lot of other kind of sports books, and with that level of rugby. And I'm sure we'll get onto it, but I self-published the book because the advice I got from an agent was that the rugby market will only come out for a big name player, of which I wasn't. I was kind of always in the division below the top division. But I felt that by leaning into those things, I could actually help my book to sort of stand out in the marketplace, for one thing. And the other thing, I felt that if I was going to sort of talk about my teammates, my coaches, things around the sport with a degree of honesty, that I had to kind of be as honest as I could be about myself and my own kind of strengths and failings. So yeah, that was something that I tried to kind of make, as a sort of point of difference about the whole project, really.
Yeah. And I guess like one of the things that sort of comes out when I read it, which rings very true, is like this sort of juxtaposition on the one hand between like the high moments of sport. Sport is like this wonderful magical thing with like these peak experiences, and this like other flip side of sport, which is as much a part of professional sports as the first part, which is like this drudgery, this monotony, this politics, this bureaucracy, things being out of your control, not getting paid on time, certain types of drama within the team, and in the case of rugby, I might get into this a little more, but like actual physical violence, which is pretty intense.
I think with professional athletes, it all looks very glamorous, and the attention accrues to the top 1%, which they're the very best and they probably deserve those things. But actually, that top 1%, they might have a lot of personal agency. I think you see it, particularly in the NBA now. They're really starting to sort of flex their muscles and demand trades, and we've seen that in European football or soccer. As I'm sure you guys prefer to refer to it, but the top players have a lot of personal agency. But actually, with most of sport, you don't have any agency. You don't have any agency about where you go, like if you get to play, about even things like what you get to wear to work. Those are things that are dictated to you, and those are things that on the one hand they make your life kind of easier, and that being regimented, they make the things you have to do easier. But on the other hand, you are kind of you're put on a bus for 12 hours, and you don't have a kind of big opinion. You don't have much kind of avenue to express yourself, unless within your environment you're maybe one of the top few players, and then beyond that in the sport, if you're not one of the top few players, I think most people, it behooves them to keep their head down and get on with it, and not rock the boat too much. Yeah,
and the economics are brutal of being sort of like trying to get into that top tier, and the toll it takes on your body is brutal. There's one part towards the end of the book. I'll just read a quick few, maybe even just a few words here. But at this point in the book, correct me if I'm misremembering, but certainly things have unraveled in a serious way. I'm not going to give away the ending. It's actually worth reading. It has a very nice dramatic arc. Things are unraveling for you, for the team, for the future of the program. At the same time, though, you're winning. Like the team is like winning matches in this final season, which makes it sort of an unusual kind of sports narrative because you expect either like one or the other, but not both. And the morale is extremely low on the team, and you tell the story that you guys, like, I guess, have a day off or something. You busted Toulouse for the afternoon as a team, and took over a corner of a local cafe to relax over coffees. When we got back, we played in the pool like children, jumping in, wrestling and playing volleyball, howling with delight when someone messed up. You say this. I mean, I love this. I think this is like, again, this is like the honesty that I'm talking about. This is like a part of, the book is about like finding your way to some extent, right? And this next sentence is, it was idiotic and childish, but joyful and somehow appropriate. We were lost boys, drifting around France, looking for meaning. And that I think is a large extent what the book's about. It's about young people trying to make it, and trying to find what they want to do with their lives. And that's like a compelling story, for everyone, far beyond rugby.
Yeah, I think like you said with sport, it sort of takes those things that are universal, that everybody wants to find some meaning to their life. It's the sort of the eternal question, what is the meaning of life? But what sport does is it compresses all those things into this condensed period. And it, like you said, it makes the peaks and troughs sort of very extreme. And you're all kind of corralled into these even the little physical spaces. You're all in the same hotel, you're sharing a room with another guy, you're all in the little swimming pool playing together. What sport does is it just focuses things that everybody can understand, but it makes it very, I suppose, more sort of powerful and time pressured than for maybe everybody else.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll say about the book, which I absolutely loved, in terms of, we get to know you, it feels like on a very intimate level, because it's also like a travel memoir. It's not just a sports memoir. It's you're in France, and in the beginning, you're learning the language. You talk about in the beginning how you're dealing with like what am I doing here? Because like the rugby is so bad in the beginning. But you're telling the story of a foreigner in a foreign country. And you talk about things like, a diversifying France in some ways. You talk about the Paris attacks at one point. You talk about Brexit, and you give commentary on everything that comes up. You talk about doping and drug abuse and alcohol abuse. At one point, you talk about the social safety net in France. And again, it just has like this great element of like a travel memoir. Someone who is commenting insightfully on their experiences as a traveler.
Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of, I go into it at the beginning of the book. I grew up watching, I was a Bath fan, but they played in European competition and I got to see Stade Toulousain, who, from the city of Toulouse. They're kind of the Manchester United, I suppose, of French rugby, the kind of glamour team. They've always got these young players full of flair. They're very exciting. And I always thought, oh, that looks great. I'd love to go to France and play. And I always loved the idea of going to France, learning the language, getting stuck into it. And when I had the opportunity to go there, I was really interested in the place. I loved living there. I admire a lot about them and how they kind of approach life. And that was one of the kind of best things about being there, was getting to, bus around, go and visit these actual other places and see these towns and speak to people. And there is that when you get there and you can't talk to anyone. It's obviously like quite difficult, but we had plenty of time. We were really lucky to get French lessons provided by the team as well. So getting stuck into France and the place was always part of the appeal. And I mean, those events, they were obviously sort of quite seismic, really. And it was bizarre to be somewhere where you don't necessarily belong and then have, like the Paris attacks were a sort of attack on Frenchness. That was how it was spun and how it was really, I suppose, while we were there. And to kind of not be French, but be there and witness all those feelings was quite fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I didn't know much. I knew very little about rugby before reading the book. One of the things I love about the book is you don't bother explaining rugby, and I love that because I did my own research. You don't need to, teach anyone anything about rugby. I guess I mean, rugby is a fascinating sport. As an American, we think of it as like American football without helmets. And as a wrestler, I think of like rugby tackles as like wrestling takedowns. But it's a very, very brutal sport. Like, for example, one of the episodes in the book that would probably horrify some people. To me, it wasn't, I think, as horrifying as it would be to most. You describe the experience of having someone trying to gouge your eyes out at the bottom of I guess it must have been a ruck, and you in return trying to break their fingers off. Can we just talk about like how brutal this is?
Yeah. So the eye gouge is kind of one of the, you can do most things in rugby. And, when I was growing up, it was perfectly legitimate to stamp on people, who are lying on the floor in order to get them out of the way of the ball. And we used to come home with these big marks, like down our backs where people had raked, it was called raking. People had raked their studs down you to encourage you to move. And, our parents didn't bat an eyelid. That was just, cost of doing business. And you're not actually even allowed to do that at the professional level now. But eye gouging is one of the few things that has just always sort of been beyond the pale. And in France, there's a more lenient attitude towards it. So, like someone putting their fingers in your eyes, obviously could be quite damaging. And in France, it's something that happened more regularly. And so once it happened to you the first time, you're sort of outraged. And then you realize it was going to happen, with a little bit more frequency than you're used to. So you just thought, right, well, if you're going to do that, I'm going to discourage you.
Yeah.
Because, you could be on the floor maybe, I don't know, 10 times a game, maybe more. So if every so often someone might try it, you need to be ready to defend yourself, I suppose.
Yeah. Were you nervous going into any particular game? You ever get nervous?
No, not really. I was like, when you played the good teams, that was kind of when you felt nerves in a good way, that would be, you'd think, well, I'm really up for this one because I'm feeling a bit like, buzzed about it. But in terms of with the violence, there was maybe only once, because we played one team in the playoffs where it sort of descended into a fight. And it was just like a really unpleasant game to play because, like you said, you're a bit like, well, if I get tackled, is someone going to do this? Is someone going to do that? And, one of our guys had his head kicked and things that when things like that start happening and you don't see a referee having a good handle on it, then you just think, oh, I don't know about this. But that probably only happened once, I think. Right. There was one particular team we developed a sort of 2-game feud with. But yeah, there wasn't really another team where that was a consideration.
It's interesting how different it is from wrestling. Because in wrestling, my experience is there's always amazing sportsmanship, just even among the most fierce rivals and competitors. And you see that also in like mixed martial arts, for example. I think combat sports, like one-on-one combat sports are famous for having on average, very good sportsmanship. And I was always, and it's not just me, I think it's very common, so nervous before stepping on the wrestling mat. And as a coach, like I would get so nervous for my guys, and I don't really know why. I mean, obviously different sports are different, and the one-on-one aspect or something. But yeah, I guess like what are you saying?
I think it's that one-on-one thing, particularly. Yeah. It's and it is this kind of test of virility that is, and rugby has an element of that. You've got a guy opposite you playing the same position, you have a bit of a one-on-one battle, but because there's so many people and it's more about the unit than it is about necessarily kind of individuals, that there's probably less of that. But I can completely see that why in a kind of one-on-one situation, it would be much more nerve-wracking.
Yeah. And a huge part of wrestling for me as both a coach and an athlete, and something I really struggled with as a wrestler, was the mental aspect of the game, like getting fired up correctly, having like you said, the good kind of nervousness as opposed to the bad kind of nervousness. Was that an element for you? Was there a mental aspect to your rugby?
I always tried to stay relaxed, really. But then it's funny because there was one game in my early 20s where I was really annoyed. I'd been out injured for ages. I was essentially, we had a cup game where they mixed the team around. It was my first game back in a couple of months. We were playing a rival and nobody seemed too bothered. I got a bit pissed off in the pre-game and gave everyone a bit of a speech. And then I played really well. So afterwards, one of the boys was like, maybe you should get angry more often before you, before you play. I always tried to keep calm, and particularly later when I was a bit more of a leader, maybe I was kind of calling plays or doing things. But yeah, there was, because I wasn't, like I said, I was never kind of a really amazing player. I never got to the level I would have wanted to have got to. So when I did have a good game, I would think, oh, what did I do before the game that time? How did I feel? What did I do with my warm up? Was there anything I did differently? And I would try to kind of learn the lessons that way. But yeah, it's hard to tell. And I think it's different for everybody else. So that's the other thing. Some people want to shout and scream, and someone would rather, not even warm up. Someone would probably rather come in, put the boots on and walk straight outside and kick off.
Yeah.
I didn't have a big routine. I used to put, my right sock on before the other, and I'd wait until I'd never put the game shirt on until the actual game. Some people would warm up in it, whereas I would wait, and then, right before we were going to go out, I'd put the game shirt on, and it would kind of close off. It'd be like, okay, like prep's over, now we're going to go out and play. But I never, I didn't have a kind of big routine like some people do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, yeah, one of the philosophical parts of the book towards the beginning that we get, because there's a lot of nice philosophical reflections in this book. So towards the beginning, we get your thoughts on the comparison, on the analogy between sports and war. And you quote someone, I forget who says that, sports is war without the weapons or something like that.
Yeah, George Orwell. Sport is war minus the shooting.
Right. Great. Yeah. And you say you don't like that analogy. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think, it's what I realized when I was developing the point was quite how intertwined the language is. It's you're going to battle, and there's all those words that creep in. But yeah, I think the consequences are where they're wildly divergent, I think. Right. And so that's where it's a little bit distasteful in a way. But in general, I can completely understand in terms of the unit, the team, you've got your plan, you need to go and do it. But even things like saying execute a plan seems kind of seems quite extreme in a way. But that's what people say, isn't it? It's like, right, we've got plays, you need to go out, you need to execute, you need to do this. Mm-hmm. And there is that interesting corollary. And I think it's the same when the people tend to have the same sort of struggles when they leave both things. When people leave sport and when people leave the military, it's the camaraderie they tend to miss. And it's also that suddenly they've got to make a lot of decisions that they never had to make before, like what clothes do you put on, and, like not being in that group and having your mind made up for you. I think those are things people do struggle with a bit. So while the comparison's apt, I don't think, because the consequences are so different, right. That's why I found it a little bit off-putting. Yeah.
And you talk about visiting like a memorial in Normandy. For example, you talk about your experience with, people who are veterans of war, and obviously it's understandable. I mean, injuries happen in sports, but you don't get the psychological injuries, that you get from war, for example. That's one difference, although also the type of injuries that you get are different as well. So that makes sense to me. But there's a analogy that I prefer, like a quote that I prefer. I don't know who said it. I don't know if anyone famous said it, but the quote is, make sure I get it right. I don't want to mess this up. Sports is to war as masturbation is to sex. And to me, that makes a lot of sense, because it really feels like you're plugging into something very primitive and very human, when you're, in sport. Does that, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I think the only thing that's maybe different is I prefer to be having sex than masturbating, but I prefer to be playing sports.
That's true. That's a good point. That's a very good point. All right. So I made a list here of some things in the book that, again, I just felt like were sort of great to see written out about sport, things that I feel like I understand from my experiences, but I never heard anyone else formulate, or even myself. Like, I never really said these things explicitly. You talk about a lot of paradoxes of sport that I think non-athletes, might not know about it or might not understand. You give an example. There's like a lot of these things. Somehow when you're feeling bad, like when you come into, let's say, I don't know if it was a practice or a game, but you're not feeling well. Sometimes you perform your best, and I was like, when I read, it's like, yes, like that's correct. I've never heard anyone say that before, but it's like 100% true. You talk about, another example of like when you put good players against bad players, and the good players like play down to the level of the bad players, or a good player on a worser team. And obviously a part of that in rugby is like knowing the plays and knowing like the movement of other players in the team. But I felt the same way, in wrestling. And things and one more piece I just want to, I actually want to read this part inside, because this part was so good. And hopefully, people will get a sense of why I love this writing so much. This was so relatable. Quote, when you're fit, there's a pleasure in the monotony of running. You won't find it hard, and you curiously push against your own limits, testing how fast you can run this one, then the next one. When you're not fit, it's another matter. Or when you don't need that weekend, or when they don't need you that weekend. Sorry, my fault. Or that month, as in the case of, I'm having such a hard time reading today, as is the case in preseason. So I'm skipping a bit. So again, like this idea of, the joy of feeling like you're in shape, and like being in practice in shape. And then you talk about when you're the difficulty of like getting in shape, when you have to get there. So you say, we had a rowing test that summer, 1,000 meters as fast as you could. The first baseline test, I didn't go hard enough, but the second time I basically had to roll off the rower and remain photo sweating on the gym floor, legs pulsing with lactic acid, doing everything I could not to shit myself. You can remember times when you felt like this. Once after a hill sprint session in the UK, I couldn't even walk about as I was so busy concentrating on not collapsing. And so, like, again, these are like experiences which are so unique to sport. They totally resonate with my experiences.
I just read an article the other day. It was a GQ article he's called Alexei Molchanov, and apparently I'd never heard of him. He's the world's best free diver, and it was exactly that. So free diving is obviously it's this incredible test of body and mind, and then part of it is that you have to go down on one breath, and when you're down there, you have to kind of remain calm and not panic, because the body's instinct is to panic and you're running out of oxygen. But the sort of argument was that you can do more than you will actually survive if you can kind of turn off the mammalian kind of reflex to panic, and actually you're literally more physiologically resilient than you think you are. And I think that's part of the thing with these tests. Nobody in life, even your personal trainer, probably won't make you try that hard. But actually you can try that hard and you'll feel terrible, but you will survive. You will walk around again, and you will be able to get up and walk out of the gym. And I think that there is something like that in sport, isn't there, where you get pushed to that point, and it's very hard to do that on your own. And obviously there's the odd individual who can do that, but I think without that group environment and having those kind of challenge days, you never get to find out those things about yourself. Yeah, for sure. Excuse me. In my wrestling experience, like one of the most brutal things that I've been subject to, and I've seen other people subject to, and to a much lesser extent, I've done to my, kids that I've coached, is you take one guy out, you pick on one guy and you say, whatever, wrestler A, wrestler B, and they go for 10 minutes, not 10 minutes, I'd say 2 minutes. I mean, and they're both spent. And then you switch out B and say, now C, your turn against wrestler A. And, and A is obviously getting more and more and more tired. And every time, that 2 minutes are over, you switch out someone else for wrestler A. And, in the sport of wrestling, I think like many sports, except you probably find some exceptions, but you can't stop. Like there's no turning it off if you're on the center, and you can really work someone. As a coach, I've never really done this because I'm too afraid of, hurting any of my guys, but you could really work someone until they puke, like, or until they collapse. And I've seen that. Excuse me. And yeah, like you're saying, you tap into reservoirs of capability that, you didn't know were possible. I think when you hear about the kind of very top level, so on the one hand, the science is obviously always getting better, and the science of like physically preparing people and how to condition them best, that's something that gets better and better and better. And sometimes you actually don't need to train as hard as you think you do to get kind of consistently fitter. When you've got all the information available, you can find out exactly, right, okay, he needs to run exactly that far, and we can see his lactic acid level go up. And once it's at that point, then we stop him. So then it means tomorrow he can go again, and the day after he can go again, and he can get that consistency of effort, and he'll improve in a relatively effortless way. Whereas I think these things you're talking about are like, okay, like they're more character tests, right? They're more, yeah, and like you say, they're more kind of building the willpower than they are the body. They're not necessarily about getting fitter. They're about, okay, right, if you are back against the wall, if you are on that mat and you're just having someone relentless come at you, like, you know, what can you do? And I think those tests, they're not things you want to do too often, but they're definitely things that can benefit you every now and again, just to, yeah, see where you're at, see what sort of person you are.
Yeah. And I guess that's another difference between professional and, you know, amateur sport, you know, because part of what comes across is, I mean, obviously your team had much more resources than most amateur teams maybe, but also there's a different style of, you have a different relationship with your coach, you know, it seems in a professional setting. And you do in the book talk about, you know, some of these tools that conditioners and teams have that maybe, you know, I'm not familiar with from, you know, the amateur side of things. But that was also part of what made the book so interesting to me, was to get that other sort of perspective, which is quite different from what I'm used to.
Yeah, I think particularly the physical trainers and anyone who has things to do with you physically, it seems you get to know a lot better. With our coach in France, we knew him personally before we went there, you know, us English guys, but with most of those coaches, you know, you don't know them really. So you don't feel like you get to know them in the same way that you do, say, the gym trainer or the physiotherapist, because those are people who are literally hands-on working with you, you know, they're with you, you have kind of a lot more casual interaction with them. And the skill in being a good physical trainer in particular is amazing. And people go about it different ways. Some people are incredibly strict and they're sort of, you know, maybe they are a bit more military style, but they're someone you don't mess about with and they have that kind of authority that they develop. And other people, they manage. So the ones that I really liked were the people that could strike a bit of a balance and bring some humor in, but then equally when they did then ask you to go to the well, as it were, you were happy to do that because they developed this kind of bond with you. And I think, you know, one is a lot more difficult than the other, but I think one equally, you know, the kind of humor approach is something that can sustain itself over a longer period of time. Whereas someone who's always your drill sergeant, you will probably grow to resent in the end, I think.
Yeah. I'm getting towards the end of my questions here, which is good. I'm curious. It doesn't really come up in the book that much. So to whatever extent you're interested in sharing, when did your like commitment to rugby start?
So yeah, I first got taken down to a rugby club when I was about 6 by my dad. And my dad didn't play, so his school, when he was growing up, they had a horrible accident, and so the whole school didn't play rugby. So he never actually really played. But he took me down to a local team just on the off chance, and I actually didn't really like it. And then it was the next year I started school when I was 7, and I started playing at school. And school, like Bath, is a like relatively small city, I suppose, in the UK, but it's got a famous rugby team. So rugby is like the kind of the sport in town. And when I was 13, that was when I joined the Bath junior team, which, although it wasn't a professional environment, it was something because everyone wanted to go. You know, the better kids tended to be there because it was the sort of glamour team to go and play for in the area. And then I got picked into the academy when I was about 15. So that was when I started kind of coming in school holidays, or, you know, like having a lot more extra training to do. And it was once I left school, that was when I really kind of committed to it.
And you have a brother? You have a brother who plays rugby also?
Yeah, he's retired now. So he retired probably 2 years ago now, but he played for Bath. So he ended up, when he finished school, he stayed in Bath. He was in the academy for probably 2 seasons, and then he got a proper contract with the first team. And he was there he was there till he was about 29 or 30, and he actually captained the team a bit as well. So he had a really good career around here. But
how was that having is it older brother?
No, he's younger. He's younger. So
how was it having a younger brother like that?
Yeah, it was great. I think we always kind of encouraged each other, and he came into the academy, and I was one of the. We were probably just about playing. We didn't play in the same teams because there was 3 years difference between us, but we used to train all together. So it was quite fun having him there for a little bit. And then once I'd moved on, then he then became a kind of leader in the academy later when he got a bit older. But yeah, it was always good fun. And when I came back from France, get the odd weekend off and go and watch him. And I always had a lot of fun with kind of following what he was doing.
Yeah. So I obviously love sport, and I have a 6-year-old son, and we do a lot of sports together, and I encourage him, and he's great. He's athletic, and it's wonderful. But one of the things that I think about and I worry about is like when I see, so for example, he does like a lot of soccer and basketball and things like that, which I love and all good. Like youth wrestling can make me feel like very uncomfortable. There was a time when I was like training in a boxing gym, and I saw like really young kids, boxing, and again, like youth wrestling, you see a lot of like wild stuff. I mean, you go around wrestling clubs and you see parents and kids, and there seems to be like a lot of pressure on these kids to engage in a sport, which is like really, physical, like really intense. And it can make you wonder, like, to what extent does the kid want this, whatever. Do you worry about that in the world of rugby? I mean, you started at such a young age.
Yeah, I did, but I never did anything I didn't want to do. I went down, I played at school, and that was just quite casual really until I was till I was 13. And then I went down to Bath because it was something I actually wanted to do more of and get better at. And I kind of made my mind up myself. But I used to play loads of different sports. So I was one of those annoying kids. I was quite good at everything. So I'd play, soccer. I was a really good swimmer. That was the sport I was probably best at. Then I played field hockey. I played tennis. I did athletics. So I sort of did everything. And then because I was still at school, I was, so a couple of my teammates left school at 16, and they went to the local college, but they didn't have kind of that much academic work. So they were then full-time training with rugby. But I kept that variety of sport through till I was about 18. And then once I left school, that's when I was kind of full-time on rugby. But yeah, I think it's the variety thing and not pushing, not pushing a kid into anything, like you say, that they don't want to do. If you give people the opportunity to kind of experiment, and with things like wrestling and with rugby, they are kind of by definition like a bit unsafe because they're a bit more physical maybe, but you can hurt yourself playing any sport. And I think actually when people are younger and if they're taught the fundamentals, then those are things that they will learn quicker, they'll learn them better. And then even if they stop wrestling, those are little skills. So maybe less so in rugby union, which was the version I played, but in rugby league, they coach wrestling because you're stuck on the floor with the ball, but you then have to get up and kind of play the ball to let the team get on with play. So they coach wrestling later. So you just never know which sport might actually benefit another sport when you grow up. So I think that range, there's a great book, Range by David Epstein, that goes into all that stuff in a kind of much greater depth than I can here. But I do think the variety is a huge thing for kids, for young people kind of getting involved.
Nice. Awesome. Finishing up here, I just wanted to read one last quote. It doesn't really fit in with any of this line of questioning, but this is just one last quote that I love. I feel like would be sort of an appropriate place to sort of end our conversation here. I guess I'm towards a little bit past the middle of the book. You write like this. I just love this this part here. I just want to make sure I'm going to read the right parts. Okay. What does it feel like to be good at a sport? When you consider your best moments on a field, you sometimes remember how it seemed so slow. The ball arrived in your hands languorously, and what to do seemed obvious in that instant. Then you were away, breaking the line and streaking up the field. You go on to describe like quotes from elite sportsmen, who describe like a similar experience in their own sport. And then you write, achieving the state of slowness and clarity is where the elite athletes truly reside, while the rest of us get to tap into it a few times when everything is just right. John Keats talked about negative capability, being able to inhabit a state of uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. the ability of an artist to rest in a state of not knowing. And you go on to describe that in more detail, but I absolutely love that. I absolutely love that section. And even for a long time, even in my wrestling days, I've always loved the artist analogy, where you have like your palette of options, of your arsenal of weapons, if you use the war analogy, and you're like throwing them at the canvas, what I'm saying? And I think you described beautifully this peak experience of sport, which ultimately is what athletes are chasing, and ultimately what, for example, I miss about my competition days, for example.
That's funny you bring that up. I think that's probably my favorite bit in the book. And you asked me what I miss about sport. And it probably is that feeling of breaking the line, and suddenly, everyone goes, like the crowd stops, but in your mind, you don't kind of hear anyone necessarily. You're just kind of thinking about what you're going to do, or you're seeing things. That Keats quote, it stuck with me from school. We did him in English GCSE, so sort of pre-16. And I remember that quote so clearly because it seemed like so applicable, beyond art, beyond poetry. And I think sport, it is art, like when done well. There's a famous Arsene Wenger quote. He used to manage Arsenal, who are my favorite football team. And he said something like, the goal of anything in life is to do it so well that it becomes an art. And I think when you watch sport, when even if you play it and you manage a little bit of brilliance, that's what you've done. You've created some performance art. And I think, again, with writing and with other kind of mediums, you get to sit there and you get to revise and go over things over and over again. And one of the sort of beauties of sport is, you can do that, but actually you have to do it in the instant for it to become that sort of transcendent moment. And I think that is why anyone plays, or that is why anyone watches. That's what you're waiting for, isn't it? Just to see that one little bit of mastery kind of in the moment.
Yeah. And that's it. And lastly, I'll just say that I think you're an amazing example of the potential of self-publishing, and I hope people, take that lesson, what someone who writes well and has a good story to tell and a good book, and that they can make it to some extent, at least to the extent to a high extent, to a high level in self-publishing. And I guess just to end up, can you tell us maybe where we could find you? Some last things about yourself. Maybe tell us about Our Race, which I think is your next project.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter, Instagram. So it's BCE Mercer. I write a newsletter. So if you go on my website, which is benmercer.me, you can find it there. My new book is Our Race, which is a project about the Great Britain 4x100 meter relay team who won gold in Athens 2004. And it's a much more, like Fringes was just me, myself, and writing about my rugby experiences. But this was more of a kind of, if not a ghostwrite, then more of a collaboration between the lot of us. There's me and another guy, Tristan Bevan, and then there's the four guys themselves. And we've kind of published that independently as well. And that's a much kind of more condensed narrative than Fringes, because it has this kind of focal event that leads up to. But it was amazing fun, and that's available as well. So you'll be able to find that if you go on Amazon.
Amazing. People should follow you. They should subscribe to your newsletter. Ben Mercer, thank you so much. I really appreciate talking to you.
Thanks. I had loads of fun.